Okay, I think you're going to like this one. Listen, usually the moral argument against the second Genesis account is that how can it be moral for God to punish us today for something that Adam and Eve did wrong all those years ago? How can that be right? Well, look, I don't give a shit about that. I don't give a shit about Adam and Eve. And no, I do give a shit about you and me. For the purposes of this video, I'm not bothered about us or our fate or how we're being tracked. I'm more interested in snakes and chimps. Snakes first. Let's deal with the snakes first. Let's get the snakes out of the way, because in this Adam and Eve story, the snake's involved, the serpent. And the serpent, what the serpent does is it misleads Eve. And it tells Eve that she should eat from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this is something that God's asked Eve not to do. But the snake says, no, it'll be okay. Eat from this tree. And so she does it. And God gets really, really pissed off about that. And he punishes everybody who's involved. And he also punishes the descendants of everybody who's involved. In just the same way that Adam and Eve is punished and their descendants are punished, so the snake is punished and all future snakes from that point on are punished. And the punishment the snake gets is that from that point on it will have to move by slithering along on its belly. Now to you and I that doesn't seem like much of a punishment for a snake, but clearly we have to infer from that for that to be a punishment that at the time snakes surely didn't move in that kind of way. Presumably they had some kind of limb arrangement at that point in time. So I could ask the same question about the snakes as we asked about Adam and Eve. Is it fair to punish today's contemporary snakes for this act committed by this snake all that time ago? Especially as really snakes are a little bit stupid, aren't they, compared to us? Can they really be held accountable in the same kind of way? But I'm not going to ask that question because it gets a lot worse than that. All we've discussed so far is the Jewish scripture. But when Christianity came along, Christians reinterpreted that and they said, no, this Jewish scripture is actually slightly wrong, because this isn't actually a snake. What it actually is the devil. It's Satan pretending to be a snake. He's disguised himself as a snake so he can mislead Eve. So my question is this: if you're a Christian, whether you are a literalist Christian and accept this as what actually happened, or whether this is just an allegory, is it moral for God to punish the snakes that are alive today for an act committed by the devil purely on the basis that he was disguised as a snake at the time? That's my first question. Okay, well, I'd like you to have a think about that, and then when you've had a think about that, move on. That's what I've done. I've had a think about that, and I've moved on, because the snakes are a lost cause, aren't they? They've lost their limbs. They're not going to get them back. God's made his decision. That's the end of it. But what about the chimps? This is really what concerns me, is the chimps, the fate of the chimps. The fate of the chimps still rests in our hands, and this is an issue that's been burning me up this morning, because what we're doing at the moment is we're communicating with chimps in zoos and in labs. And let's just say this biblical literal account is true. And let's say that the devil does the same trick again, but this time not as a snake. He disguises himself as a common chimp or a bonobo. And then what we do is we think we're communicating with a chimp, but we're not. We're communicating with the devil. And he does the same thing again. He misleads us again. And God, applying the same morality as he applied last time, because he loves to be consistent, God, he feels he has to extirpate the limbs of every single chimp alive and every single chimp born in the future. You see, it wasn't too bad for the snakes, because the snakes were lucky. They're kind of long, thin, bendy animals, and when they lost their limbs they could still move fine. But it's not so easy for chimps. You take the limbs off a chimp and it can't, I mean, chimps just aren't cut out for crawling along the ground. I mean, it's not a natural mode of perambulation for a large primate. And they lead a sort of semi-arboreal existence, don't they? It's going to have to kind of drag itself up the tree by its mouth. So this is the question I have. If you're a biblical literalist, or if you're not, just imagine if you were a biblical literalist, would you be actively campaigning to stop these kinds of experiments on the grounds that we're placing all chimps in a very real mortal danger? One more question. If it did happen, if the devil does disguise himself as a chimp and we communicate with him and we get misled and God rips the arms off all the chimps and all the chimps are there in the chimp enclosures of the zoos and of the conservation areas where we come into contact with them, and they're all flailing on the floor, slowly starving to death, should we leave them to starve to death on the grounds that we're interfering with God's moral decision? Or should we attempt to feed them and maybe to house them, maybe to design them some kind of prosthetic chimp limbs and help them out? Which should we do? Should we interfere in that kind of way? What would be the moral thing for us to do once God had done his act of benevolence on the chimps? Okay, well, that's the questions. 3 questions there. Thank you for watching this video. Bye for now.